Hello and welcome to our presentation on the implementation staircase. This is a presentation by Reem and Claire, and in this presentation we will try to give a description of the approach, contrast it with a more technical, rational approach to policy making and relate it to some practical examples within our own context. And we've also thought about how it can be applied to research and some of the strengths and limitations of the approach. So what do we mean by the implementation staircase? Well, I think we were both drawn to this approach because of the idea of the staircase. It was something that was quite clear, something that you could latch onto. And it's a metaphor to describe policy change and practice. And it was first coined, we believe, by Reynolds and Saunders in 1985. And it's this idea that policy is not just enforced upon us, it's not a clear, doesn't have a clear trajectory. We're both receivers and agents of the policy. And there's a quote here which sums up this view. So participants are both receivers and agents of policy, and as such their production of policy reflect priorities, pressures and interests, characterising their location on an implementation staircase. So, as we said, this approach considers policy as complex. It's a far messier process than we might believe. It's definitely something that we believed at the beginning, that policy was a bit clearer, and policy making will undergo different versions. It's also, policy making can also be at the micro, meso and micro level, and we also have to consider the different power relations organised when we're the different power relations when we consider policy, and also the different people who are organised, different stakeholders who are involved in policy making. So the sort of top-down influences, the governments, and the bottom-up influence, perhaps the teachers. So this idea with a more technical, rational approach to policy making is that policy has a clear journey. The people at the top have a clear idea about what they want to achieve with this policy, and it will be filtered down the staircase in a clear way. But as we know, there are so many different people involved and different ideas about policy that it's not as clear, not as simple as that. And we've got this quote here that a step on the staircase could be seen as a representation of particular types of constituencies, all with their own set of social, cultural rules and practices, and who will interpret policy according to these. Therefore, there is a high likelihood that power will be interpreted in a manner that is not intended by those who created it. So just because we have an idea about how we want a policy or strategy to be enforced or implemented doesn't mean that the people on the ground will interpret it in the same way. And even if they seem to be going along with this policy or this strategy, it doesn't mean that they've really bought into it. And I think that's something to always consider when we're looking at policy making. So we've already seen that policy making is a lot messier than we might think, and we've got some contrasts here between the implementation staircase approach and the rational purpose of a model. As we've seen, that policies are conceived and formulated at the highest level and expected to just kind of go very smoothly down the staircase, but as we've seen, that each step on the staircase have different views, different initiatives, different agendas. Policy making is not one way, it's going to be going up and down the staircase, perhaps even sideways. Organisations may seem to share the same goals, but there are different subcultures, and in these different subcultures, again, people see things differently, and that will influence policy making. And finally, policy and practice in a more technical, rational approach, they're seen as distinct elements, but here in this implementation staircase model, they're seen as being more closely linked, influenced by each other. So to sum this all up, policy making is a messy process. Individuals and groups are influential in the production of the policy, depending on how relevant they perceive it to be. As I said before, it's not nearly as straightforward as we might think. So this is a diagram to show the implementation staircase. These are supposed to be the steps. It's a little bit small because I couldn't get it onto the slide, but I hope that you can see here that there's a loosely coupled relationship between these policy initiatives at the top level. So here it's the national level. So they might make, central government makes formal HE policy and establishes funding regimes, and it trickles down these different levels and these different steps, and they're influenced by different forces. So we've got institutional, departmental, classrooms, and at the bottom, individuals. And as we saw before, on the implementation staircase, policy making is seen as being two-way. So this is one example in practice. This is implementing graded observations in an HE faculty. There's the quality assurance procedures. They wanted to, in the institution, they wanted to enforce this idea of graded observations, but they weren't perceived in such a positive light, and there's had to be negotiations up and down the staircase. So there has been so that the policy is received more positively at the micro and at the meso level as well. This is another example. This is a change in the students' mandatory attendance policy. So again, we're filtering down from the government all the way down to the students, and we can see here that sometimes it was felt that their role was ignored, so the policy had to keep going through different versions, and again until there's some kind of compromise is reached. So with these differences in how policies and strategies are received, we can see that there can be an implementation gap, so the distance between original purposes and the actual outcomes, and this is particularly evident at the lowest step, so at the micro or maybe the meso level, where stakeholders will be most affected. So possibly the teachers, they will not see a policy in the same way as at the top level, and again it will need to be adapted so they receive they interpret it in a more positive way. So Ream came up with these implications for research design. What are the implications of this implementation staircase? It helps to explain the reasons for an implementation gap. It predicts how different participants will see the policy depending on their interests and perceptions. And we can also follow a policy through its trajectory. We can see how policy goes through different versions. It won't be as straightforward as we might think. So what are the strengths of the model? Well, it offers strategic and operational viewpoints. As we've seen, it highlights the complexity of policy implementation. It's a messy process. There's lots of different variables to consider, and it's situated. It's all contextualized. It emphasizes the different experiences of stakeholders. And finally, what are the limitations of the approach? So, does policy just go up and down a staircase? Is it that sort of two-directional approach? Is it very linear? Or does it bypass some of these stakeholders on the staircase? Is it always that way, just filtering down the staircase and maybe filtering back up again? And I think to understand the policy making, we need to have an understanding of the intentions, knowledge and cultural background at each level, which of course is very difficult. It's difficult to look at people's cultures, different cultures of organisations. It's very complex. So that's another possibly limitation of the approach. So thank you very much for viewing and listening to this presentation. We hope you have understood what we meant, and of course if you have any questions then please post them to the forum. We just have some final references that we used when we were researching this approach. Thank you.